It was a winter day in 1958 when the Empress of Iran, Soraya Bakhtiari, stepped into the waiting aircraft that would carry her away from Tehran. She wore a black coat and dark glasses that concealed her swollen eyes, yet nothing could veil the silence of the crowd gathered to witness her departure. The queen, who had once been celebrated for her luminous smile, now left her homeland not as a sovereign, but as a woman who had failed in the eyes of dynasty. Behind her, the palaces of marble and gold grew smaller in the distance, and ahead stretched only uncertainty, exile, and the quiet ache of lost love. Dear listener, before we begin this long journey into memory and time, I invite you to share with us in the comments when and where you are listening. In this way, you become part of a living network of memory across the world. And if you wish to keep this circle of remembrance alive, you may gently press the subscribe button so that these stories may continue to travel from one heart to another. The sound of the aircraft engine trembled through the cold morning air as Soraya took her seat by the window. She looked out, though what she saw was blurred by both glass and grief. The familiar shapes of Tehran, the white-capped Alborz mountains, the winding streets, all dissolved into mist and distance. Perhaps she tried to fix one last image in her heart, the rose garden of Sadabad Palace, the scent of jasmine at night, the way the Shah would look at her in the earliest days of their love. But memory has a way of shifting when sorrow presses too heavily upon it. And what she carried with her that day was not clarity, but fragments, some sharp, some fading. It is said that when she left, a hush fell over the capital, as though the city itself could feel the absence. Some recalled her as a star of rare beauty, the Persian Cinderella, whose grace had enchanted photographers from Paris to New York. Others murmured of her quiet dignity, her fragile voice, and the way she seemed almost like a figure from a dream rather than a queen of flesh and blood. Yet others whispered judgment, harsh and unforgiving, that she had failed to provide an heir, and thus had betrayed both duty and nation. Between adoration and reproach, Soraya departed without speaking, her silence deeper than any proclamation could have been. In the stillness of her cabin, she may have recalled how swiftly life can transform from radiance to shadow. Only a few years earlier, she had stood at the Shah's side as a bride, clothed in a silver gown woven in Paris, her head crowned with diamonds, her lips trembling with both joy and fear. She was 19 then, barely a woman, chosen to be consort to the ruler of an empire. At that moment, all possibilities lay open: love, family, children, the promise of a dynasty secured. Yet by the time the aircraft left the runway, those possibilities had collapsed into a single truth: she would never again be the Queen of Iran. As the clouds gathered outside the window, one wonders what prayers or questions passed silently through her thoughts. Did she still believe in destiny, in the hand of fate that had once raised her from a provincial childhood to the pinnacle of power? Or had she already begun to doubt that there is any justice in the weaving of human lives? The old Persian poets speak often of fortune as a fickle companion, one who smiles sweetly and then turns away without warning. Was this now her companion as she pressed her cheek against the cold glass? History records her exile as the natural outcome of politics and tradition. A queen who could not bear a child was no queen at all, for the continuity of monarchy was rooted not in romance, but in bloodline. Yet beneath this explanation lies another truth, less visible, more intimate. Soraya was loved by the Shah, loved sincerely, perhaps more deeply than any other woman he ever held close. But love, in her case, could not outweigh necessity. What, then, is the worth of love when measured against the demands of empire? Can affection survive when weighed upon scales of lineage and power? Such questions linger, refusing resolution, echoing still in the silence left behind her. As the plane crossed into European skies, she entered another existence, one where she would be neither ruler nor exile in the strictest sense, but something more ambiguous, a living relic of a vanished dream. In Paris, in Rome, in the hotels of Munich, and the cafes of the Riviera, she would be admired again, photographed again, and courted by admirers who found in her the aura of mystery that clings to fallen royalty. Yet behind each smile for the camera lay the memory of that first departure, the severing of her bond with her country and her throne. The air inside the cabin must have been heavy with the scent of fuel and leather, the sound of the engines humming like a distant lament. Around her sat attendants and companions, but none could pierce the solitude that wrapped itself about her like a cloak. The act of leaving is always double. One leaves a place, but one is also left by those who remain. Perhaps she wondered, in those early hours of her exile, how she would be remembered in the minds of her people. Would they speak her name with tenderness, or would it vanish altogether from the story of the nation? For every queen who ascends a throne, there are countless others whose names are forgotten. Soraya knew this well. She had once been almost unknown, the daughter of a Persian diplomat and a German mother, her life shaped by boarding schools and distant relatives. And then, within a brief span of years, she was swept into a marriage that made her the empress of one of the most ancient lands of the world. Now, just as suddenly, she was cast adrift again. Could such a rise and fall be anything but the design of some inscrutable fate? The windows of the plane grew fogged with condensation, and the world outside became formless. In that blurred view, one might see a symbol of her own life at that moment. Clear lines dissolving, familiar shapes vanishing, the future hidden beyond mist. The sound of the engines continued without pause, carrying her further from Tehran, further from the scent of roses, further from the call of the muezzin at dawn. She closed her eyes, perhaps seeking rest, but in the silence behind her lids, she saw again the Shah's face, young still, earnest still, yet distant already, separated by the chasm of destiny. And so, part one closes with that unresolved image. Soraya seated by the window, her reflection faint upon the glass, the sky beyond shifting between light and shadow. Was she looking outward into the distance or inward into memory? Perhaps both. The truth, like the mist outside, cannot be fixed, only felt. Her reflection upon the glass of the airplane window remained as if etched into her mind, faint and wavering, a shadow of herself caught between earth and sky. When the image dissolved into mist, it gave way to another, softer and more distant, one that reached further back into the folds of memory. Long before she had been queen, long before the palace walls and the flashing cameras, Soraya was a child in Isfahan, a place where the air carried the scent of dust after rain, and the sound of footsteps on stone seemed older than memory itself. She was born in 1932 into the house of Isfandiari Bakhtiari, a lineage with roots deep in the soil of Persia, and yet her upbringing was already stretched between two worlds. Her father, Khalil Isfandiari, was of noble Persian descent, a diplomat whose service carried him across Europe. Her mother, Eva Karl, was German, fair-haired and foreign, a presence both loved and questioned within the family. Thus, Soraya entered life not as wholly Persian, nor wholly European, but as a bridge between cultures, belonging and not belonging all at once. In her earliest years, Isfahan was her cradle. There, the domes and minarets glimmered in the sunlight, and the river Zayandeh flowed like a quiet ribbon through the heart of the city. It was here she first learned the solitude of gardens, the music of fountains, and the long silence of evening when lamps were lit and the air grew heavy with jasmine. Yet Isfahan would not hold her long. Her father's duties pulled the family toward Berlin, and soon the little girl who had once chased shadows along Persian courtyards found herself among the dark forests and cold winters of Germany. Imagine the contrast. Sunlit tiles of turquoise exchanged for streets gray with frost, the gentle cadence of Persian verse traded for the harsh consonants of German speech. For Soraya, childhood was already a movement between worlds, never wholly anchored in one. Perhaps it was this shifting ground that gave her a quality others later found so enigmatic, the sense that she carried within her both presence and distance, warmth and detachment, as though she were never entirely of the place she stood in. In Berlin, she attended school, quiet among the chatter of other children, tall already, her beauty forming early like a secret she had yet to understand. Teachers recalled her as reserved, often absorbed in thought, her gaze drifting toward the window rather than the blackboard. War gathered over Europe then, and though she was shielded by her father's diplomatic ties, the echoes of conflict seeped into her world. The sound of sirens, the uneasy silence after bombardments, the faces of those who had lost too much, all these must have marked her tender years with impressions too deep to erase. Childhood, then, was never entirely carefree. Already she was learning that history presses upon the lives of the small as much as upon the lives of the great. What does it mean, one might ask, for a child to grow between cultures, to feel both the intimacy of belonging and the chill of distance? Does it create a heart that is more expansive, able to hold many worlds? Or does it create a soul forever wandering, never fully at home in any? Soraya's later years suggest both truths at once. She could dazzle in European salons as though she had been born to them, yet she carried always the fragrance of Persian gardens in her memory. She could speak German fluently, yet the music of her Persian name carried within it a weight that no foreign language could dissolve. By the time adolescence came, she was already marked by fragility of health. Illness often confined her to bed, her tall frame weakened by recurring fevers and ailments. Perhaps it was here, in these long hours of solitude, that she learned the inwardness that later defined her presence. She read, she dreamed, she watched the play of light upon the walls. Outside, the world grew louder with war, but inside, she cultivated the stillness of one who listens more to her own heart than to the tumult beyond. When the war ended and Europe stumbled into its weary aftermath, Soraya was no longer a child. She had grown into a young woman whose beauty startled those who met her. Her features, a mingling of Persian and German bloodlines, carried a striking harmony. High cheekbones, luminous eyes, hair dark as ink. Yet alongside this radiance, there was shyness, a reluctance to stand fully in the gaze of others. Beauty, for her, was not a mask she wielded with confidence, but something she endured, as though it belonged more to the eyes of the beholder than to herself. And so, when fate began to weave her name into the destiny of a king, it did not appear to her as ambition fulfilled, but as a bewildering turn of life's path. The royal family of Iran, seeking a suitable consort for the Shah, cast their gaze across noble houses, and word reached them of the tall and graceful daughter of Khalil Esfandiari. Arrangements were made, photographs exchanged, whispers spread through the family. Soraya, barely 19, was told she would meet the ruler of her father's homeland. Imagine the heart of that young woman, half Persian, half European, suddenly summoned to the attention of a monarch. Did she feel chosen, or merely swept by a tide greater than herself? Did she see the hand of destiny, or only the shadow of obligation? In those days before the encounter, she must have looked into the mirror with new eyes. The girl who had been marked by illness, who had wandered between languages and continents, now stood at the threshold of another life. The reflection in the glass of her childhood was gone. In its place was a face about to be offered to the judgment of a king. The echoes of Isfahan lingered in her memory, the cool courtyards, the fountains at dusk, but now they mixed with the memory of Berlin's cold skies, and the weight of expectation pressed heavily upon her slender frame. The mirror's faint reflection lingered in her eyes as she stepped away, and soon it dissolved into another reflection, this time not of glass, but of another human being. The day of her first meeting with Mohammad Reza Pahlavi arrived with a hush of anticipation, as though the air itself bore witness to the gravity of what was about to unfold. He was the Shah of Iran, a man burdened already with the weight of crown and empire, yet still a young man longing for companionship, for beauty, for a wife who might share both his solitude and his duty. She was 19, tall, radiant yet hesitant, with a smile that carried both shyness and allure. When their eyes first met, those present would later recall a sudden stillness, as though the world itself had paused to allow destiny to step gently into the room. He was instantly struck. Her dark hair, her luminous gaze, the delicate curve of her face. These seemed to him not only signs of beauty, but also omens of fortune. To her, the Shah's presence was overwhelming. The authority of his title, the aura of a man set apart from others by the invisible wall of kingship. Yet within his eyes there was warmth, a softness that seemed to promise affection beyond duty. Between them, words were exchanged, tentative at first, restrained by formality. But beneath those words flowed a current of feeling not easily concealed. They spoke of simple things, of family, of places they had known. In his voice she detected both command and vulnerability. In hers he sensed both fragility and grace. It is said that love can bloom in a single glance, though whether this was true for them remains forever uncertain. Was it love, or the weight of expectation, or the spell of circumstance that drew them closer? For her, the encounter must have been dizzying. To step from the quiet anonymity of a diplomat's daughter into the gaze of a monarch was to enter a realm of possibility both enchanting and perilous. Did she see in that moment the shadow of her own future? Palaces, jewels, power mingled with solitude? Or did she simply see a man who looked at her with admiration and nothing more? The Shah was not a man free to love without consequence. His first marriage to Princess Fawzia of Egypt had ended in sorrow, leaving him wounded and wary. Now, with Soraya, he glimpsed the chance for renewal, a chance to heal both heart and dynasty. He saw in her not only beauty but also the possibility of children, heirs to secure his line. In his eyes, her foreign education and mixed heritage were not flaws but qualities that might bring refinement and modernity to his court. And so, with a mixture of personal desire and political necessity, he resolved to make her his bride. The days that followed must have unfolded like a dream for Soraya, yet a dream heavy with both wonder and unease. Preparations were whispered in corridors, garments measured, jewels displayed, astrologers consulted. The court spoke of her as though she were already queen, yet within her heart, doubt surely lingered. She was young, untried, uncertain of her own strength. Could she bear the weight of the peacock throne? Could she live under the unblinking gaze of a nation? These questions, silent and unspoken, must have accompanied her even as she accepted the Shah's proposal. Their engagement was announced, and the world took notice. Newspapers displayed her photograph, marveling at her beauty, dubbing her the fairytale bride. In her portrait, one sees the luminous eyes, the graceful carriage, and yet if one looks closely, perhaps also a trace of melancholy, as though she already sensed that beauty alone would not protect her from the trials to come. The wedding, held in 1951, was an event of splendor. The gown, crafted in Paris by Christian Dior, shimmered like moonlight woven into fabric. It weighed heavily upon her young frame, embroidered with silver threads and sequins, its train stretching like a river of light. Upon her head rested a tiara glittering with diamonds, yet more radiant still was the aura of youth and promise she carried. The ceremony was lavish, attended by dignitaries and envoys, celebrated across continents as the union of East and West, tradition and modernity. Yet beneath the music and the lights, one wonders what Soraya herself felt. Did she walk toward the Shah with confidence, or with trembling steps hidden beneath silken folds? Did her heart beat with love, or with fear of what lay beyond the grandeur? For to marry a king is not to enter a life of ease, but a life in which one's very existence becomes emblem, symbol, and sacrifice. The personal dissolves into the political, and the private into the public. Did she understand this fully, or only dimly sense it as the vows were spoken and the cameras flashed? Their early years together seemed touched by genuine affection. The Shah was attentive, tender, devoted to her in ways that surprised even those within the court. He showered her with gifts, accompanied her with warmth, and spoke often of his deep love. In private, he sought her company, her laughter, her presence. For Soraya, these must have been moments of reassurance, the sense that beyond the heavy crown and the gaze of courtiers, there existed a bond of human intimacy. Yet the bond was fragile, for always beyond their embrace lay the looming question of heirs, the silent demand of dynasty. And so, as the mirror of her childhood had reflected uncertainty, the eyes of her husband now reflected both love and expectation. In his gaze she saw tenderness, yet also the unspoken question. Would she bear him a son? Would she secure his throne? This dual gaze defined their union from the very beginning, casting both warmth and shadow upon their love. The world looked upon them as a perfect pair. The handsome young Shah, the radiant Empress, their smiles captured in photographs that seemed to promise an age of renewal for Iran. Yet photographs do not reveal the weight of silence in the chambers of palaces, nor the loneliness of a queen who wonders if her worth will be measured not by her heart but by her womb. Soraya must have felt this from the very first days, though she concealed it with grace, her eyes always luminous, her posture always poised. The sound of wedding music still lingered in the air, yet as the echoes faded into memory, they gave way to a deeper, more solemn rhythm, the measured footsteps of ceremony, the grandeur of coronation. The image of the young bride standing beside her husband transformed into that of a queen, seated upon a throne whose weight was not only of gold and jewels, but of centuries of expectation. Soraya's face, luminous beneath the diadem, was now no longer simply that of a woman beloved, but of an empress whose presence was meant to embody the hopes of a nation. The coronation was not merely ritual, it was spectacle, a weaving together of symbols both ancient and modern. The halls of Tehran shone with light. Courtiers and dignitaries, dressed in embroidered uniforms and heavy sashes, filled the space with whispers and the rustling of silk. Outside, the streets were alive with people, their eyes straining to glimpse the figure who had become their queen. Photographers captured every angle, their cameras hungry for the image that would travel across oceans and appear in the glossy pages of foreign magazines. Soraya, the girl who once wandered the quiet gardens of Isfahan and the gray streets of Berlin, now sat at the heart of empire, her beauty displayed as though it were a jewel belonging not only to her but to the entire realm. And yet, within that splendor lay silence, a silence known only to her heart. To wear a crown is to feel the paradox of radiance and isolation. For the people who cheered outside, she was a figure of almost mythic allure. For her husband, she was beloved, cherished. But for herself, she was perhaps still that girl uncertain before the mirror, wondering whether she was truly chosen by fate or merely carried forward by a tide she could not resist. The crown gleamed above her brow, but beneath its shimmer pressed the quiet weight of doubt. The court adored her beauty. European journalists compared her to film stars, praising her elegance, her carriage, her gaze. She became an emblem of modern Iran, a bridge between tradition and the allure of the West. Women studied her style, men praised her refinement. The world seemed momentarily enchanted by her presence. But in the midst of this admiration, what did she feel? To be admired is not always to be understood, and to be celebrated is not always to be known. Did she sense even then that her role as queen might be more image than intimacy, more symbol than self? Her days at the palace unfolded with all the pageantry of royalty. Banquets glittered with silverware and crystal. State visits brought her face to face with the world's dignitaries, and evenings were filled with dances, orchestras, and the murmur of conversation in many tongues. Yet within the grand halls, echoes lingered that no music could dispel. The silence of corridors late at night, the loneliness of a chamber too vast for comfort, the sense that one's life is never one's own but forever in the gaze of others. These were the unseen companions of her queenship. It was in these moments that Soraya began to reveal, quietly, the other side of her nature. She loved beauty, but not excess. She enjoyed company, but often withdrew into solitude. Her health remained fragile, and often she spent hours away from public life, resting, gazing through windows into gardens where fountains whispered softly in the dark. Courtiers may have wondered at her quietness, interpreting it as aloofness, yet in truth it was the mark of her inwardness, the trace of a girl shaped as much by solitude as by ceremony. Her marriage to the Shah, though tender, also carried the strain of public expectation. The love between them was real, felt in glances, in gestures, in the rare moments of privacy when they could escape the eyes of the world. He called her his only love, the one who had captured his heart most fully. She responded with affection, though hers was of a quieter kind, perhaps more hesitant, shaped by her own fragility. Yet beneath their tenderness lay that silent demand, unspoken but ever present, the need for an heir. The court, the nation, the dynasty, all looked toward her womb as the vessel of continuity. Every glance upon her was colored by the question, would she bear a son? Would she secure the throne for generations to come? At first, hope lingered. Physicians were consulted, prayers offered, whispers silenced by reassurances. But as months became years, as attempts failed and the palace grew heavy with anticipation unmet, the silence deepened. In this silence lay the seed of tragedy. For love can bind two hearts, but when empire demands more than love, even the deepest affection may falter. And so, the crown that once gleamed as promise began to press more heavily upon her. To be queen was to embody joy for the people, yet within she bore sorrow. To smile for the cameras, to attend ceremonies, to walk among the gardens with grace, while knowing that judgment whispered behind every door. This was her hidden labor. Perhaps she sought solace in small things, the scent of roses at dusk, the light upon marble walls, the fleeting laughter of children in courtyards. But such solace could never fully erase the knowledge that she was being weighed and found wanting, not as a woman, but as an empress bound by expectation. Still, she endured, with grace, with dignity, with the poise of one who carries her sorrow silently. For to falter openly would have been to break the illusion of monarchy, and illusions, once broken, are not easily restored. The Shah continued to love her, to defend her against whispers, to insist upon her worth beyond childbearing. Yet he too was not free. His crown was a chain, binding him to duty. Between them stretched the gulf between love and necessity, growing wider with each passing year. The mirror still glowed faintly in her chamber, her reflection dissolving into the shadows as the night deepened. From this quiet, we pass into the long corridors of the palace, where each day began not with the intimacy of private life, but with ritual, order, and the weight of tradition. Morning light filtered through tall windows, striking the marble floors with cold brilliance. Servants moved silently, their footsteps hushed against carpets, preparing trays of tea and fruit, arranging garments, opening doors to halls that would soon echo with voices and footsteps. For Soraya, each dawn in the palace was both promise and burden, a day already scripted by duty before her eyes had fully opened. The rhythms of court life followed their own unchanging pattern. Audiences with dignitaries, receptions for foreign envoys, councils of advisors, and endless ceremonies filled the hours. As queen consort, Soraya's presence was demanded in each, her role less to act than to embody. She was the face of grace, the silent counterpart to the Shah's authority, the image of refinement projected to both people and world. To wear gowns of shimmering silk, to walk slowly down the long carpeted halls, to bow her head at the right moment. Such gestures, though outwardly simple, became exhausting when repeated endlessly, especially for one who craved not spectacle, but quiet. The palace itself was vast, a world unto its own. Its gardens spread outward, fountains murmuring among roses and cypresses. In the evenings, the scent of jasmine drifted through the open windows. Yet even beauty can become prison when it is bound by repetition. Soraya wandered sometimes in those gardens, accompanied by ladies in waiting, their whispers carried softly behind her. Children of courtiers played at a distance, their laughter striking her heart with a pang of longing she could not express. For within her lay both the tenderness of a woman who dreamed of children and the sorrow of one who knew her arms would likely remain empty. The Shah adored her still in those years, his devotion visible in the way he looked at her across banquet tables, or in the way he placed his hand lightly on hers during receptions. Yet even his affection could not dissolve the tension pressing upon them both. His advisors murmured, his ministers suggested, his people wondered. Where was the heir? Where was the future of the dynasty? The sound of these questions was never voiced openly in her presence, yet their echo filled the silence around her. Every smile she offered, every gown she wore, every step she took through the glittering halls seemed overshadowed by that single absence. The daily ceremonies offered her little relief. When ambassadors bowed and spoke their greetings, she smiled with practiced warmth. When foreign queens or first ladies complimented her beauty, she thanked them with grace. When courtiers whispered admiration, she nodded politely. Yet beneath each gesture lay the awareness that all of it was surface, that what truly mattered was beyond her reach. How does one endure a life where one is both celebrated and silently judged at once? Soraya endured with dignity, but in her private chambers she grew quiet, introspective, almost fragile in her solitude. At times she turned to art for solace. She admired painting, music, the small expressions of creativity that brought color into the stillness. On rare evenings when the palace was hushed, she would listen to records, her thoughts drifting far from Tehran, perhaps back to the rivers of Isfahan or the woods of Germany. The melodies touched something in her that ceremony could not reach, the part of her that longed not for crowns but for ordinary joys. Laughter at a kitchen table, the warmth of children's voices, the embrace of family unobserved by cameras or courtiers. Even her beauty, which had elevated her to fame, became at times a silent chain. She was admired, yes, but also reduced to an image. Foreign magazines praised her elegance as though it were her only gift. Did they ever see the depth of her eyes? The thoughtfulness that lived behind her reserved smile? Did they know of her struggles with health, her hours spent in quiet weakness, her battle against fatigue that seemed to shadow her from youth? Beauty is both gift and mask, and for Soraya it was often the mask that hid her true self from the world. Her role at the palace was not without moments of sweetness. There were nights when she and the Shah dined privately, speaking not of politics but of their shared memories, their quiet affection. He would tell her of his dreams for Iran's future, and she would listen with gentle patience. They spoke of journeys they might take, of gardens they might visit. For brief hours, the crown receded, and they were simply husband and wife. But these moments, though real, were fleeting, always interrupted by the demands of state, always shadowed by the unfulfilled desire for children. And so, palace life continued, glittering yet hollow, radiant yet sorrowful. The rituals of court did not change. The ceremonies unfolded as they always had. Yet within Soraya a heaviness grew. Each banquet ended with silence, each reception with fatigue, each audience with the sense of a part played rather than a life lived. The sound of fountains in the garden became to her less a melody of peace and more a reminder of solitude. Nights stretched long, and her gaze upon the mirror grew more searching, as though she sought to find within herself the strength to endure what destiny withheld. As years passed, the gap between her outward image and her inner world widened. To the people, she was still the beloved queen, the elegant empress, the shining jewel at the Shah's side. To herself, she was increasingly a figure of isolation, carrying a sorrow unspoken but ever present. Was it fate, or was it chance? Was she chosen for love, or chosen only to serve a role that would ultimately consume her? These questions, like shadows, lingered around her as she walked through the vast halls of marble and gold. The laughter of children carried across the garden, soft at first, then fading into the distance until only the sound of the fountains remained. That faint echo lingered in Soraya's heart, stirring both tenderness and sorrow, and from this moment we moved gently into the deeper silence that surrounded her life, the silence of expectation unmet, the silence of infertility. It was a silence that did not belong only to her, but to the palace itself. For every hall, every chamber, every whispered conversation seemed to circle around the same unspoken question. Where was the heir? At first, there had been hope. In the early years of her marriage, doctors reassured the Shah and his queen that time would yield its gift. Courtiers spoke confidently. Astrologers offered auspicious readings, and Soraya herself must have believed that nature would not deny her this most ordinary blessing. Months passed, then years, and still her arms remained empty. The palace, with all its glittering grandeur, grew heavy with anticipation. Each smile from courtiers, each glance from the people carried a weight beneath it, a weight Soraya felt deeply even when unspoken. The physicians were summoned, examinations were conducted, remedies prescribed, attempts made with hope renewed each time. Western specialists traveled to Tehran, bringing with them instruments and theories, promising solutions that often dissolved into disappointment. For Soraya, these visits must have been both invasive and humiliating, her body subjected to scrutiny not as her own, but as the vessel of dynasty. Each report, each verdict cut deeper, eroding not only her hope, but her sense of self, to be judged not as woman, but as womb. How does a heart bear such judgment? The Shah stood beside her through these trials, his affection genuine, his tenderness sincere. He reassured her, defended her against whispers, insisted that their love was enough. Yet even he could not silence the voices of lineage, of tradition, of politics. Advisors pressed upon him the necessity of succession. Ministers warned of instability without an heir. Courtiers murmured of alternatives, of other wives, of concubines. Though the Shah resisted, though he clung to Soraya with devotion, the tension grew, pressing between them like an invisible wall. For Soraya, each passing year deepened the sense of inadequacy. She who had been celebrated for beauty now became silently measured for what she could not give. Her nights grew long, her solitude heavier, her gaze upon the mirror more searching, as though she hoped to glimpse within herself the strength to endure what destiny had withheld. Perhaps she prayed in the quiet hours, whispered pleas to God, to fate, to whatever unseen hand might grant her a child. Yet prayers, too, dissolved into silence, leaving her face wet with tears unseen by courtiers or cameras. The people, too, felt the absence. Though they admired her grace, though they cherished her as their queen, whispers spread through bazaars and markets, through homes and gatherings. Every royal visit, every ceremony, every photograph published abroad brought the same murmur. Where was the child? The absence became not only private sorrow but public matter, transforming Soraya's most intimate grief into a wound carried by the nation. How cruel it must have been to bear such loss, not in secrecy, but under the gaze of millions. In the palace, attempts to lighten her burden sometimes came in the form of gifts, distractions, journeys. The Shah took her to Europe, to Paris, to the Riviera, offering her the glamour of travel, the escape of foreign cities. Photographers captured her strolling boulevards, attending galas, her beauty dazzling still. Yet beneath the gowns and jewels, beneath the laughter offered to society, there lingered the shadow of the same question, one that followed her across seas and borders. Why not a child? Even among strangers she could not escape it, for newspapers speculated, commentators remarked, and admirers pitied her with silent eyes. Illness, too, compounded her sorrow. Her health, fragile since youth, often faltered under the strain. Doctors prescribed rest, treatments, regimens. She grew thin. Her body weakened, her spirit fatigued. Was it her body that betrayed her, or was it fate itself that closed the door? No physician could answer, no diagnosis could fully explain. The uncertainty became itself another torment, for it left her with neither cure nor acceptance, only endless waiting. The Shah, for all his devotion, began to feel the pull of duty. His love for Soraya was profound, perhaps the deepest of his life, yet he was king not only of himself, but of a nation. Without an heir, the monarchy stood vulnerable. Rivals murmured, foreign powers speculated, the dynasty trembled in its foundations. He tried to resist, to cling to their union against the tide of necessity, but already the current was too strong. Between his heart and his crown stretched a rift he could not mend. In the quiet of her chambers, Soraya must have sensed the inevitability long before it was spoken. Love, she knew, was not always enough to shield one from the demands of history. She had tasted its sweetness in the Shah's embrace, had felt its warmth in his words. But she also saw the sorrow in his eyes when yet another attempt failed, when yet another month passed without news. Between them stretched not anger but grief, the sorrow of two hearts bound together yet pulled apart by forces larger than themselves. And so, as the fountains murmured in the gardens, as children's laughter drifted across courtyards, Soraya bore her sorrow with silence. To complain would have been to wound the man she loved. To despair openly would have been to betray her dignity. Instead, she carried it quietly, as queens so often must, her face radiant, still before the world, her heart shadowed within. The pen in her hand never touched the page, and so the letter remained unwritten. That silence upon the desk, heavy with unspoken words, became the doorway into the deeper silence that now entered her marriage. Between Soraya and the Shah, love remained, tender still, but its voice was drowned by the louder call of duty, the cry of a dynasty that could not be secured by affection alone. Their bond, once so luminous, now trembled like a flame pressed upon by unseen winds. It began with pauses in conversation, moments when eyes turned away rather than toward one another. He, the ruler of an empire, burdened by counsels and advisers who pressed upon him the question of succession. She, his queen, carrying within her the sorrow of knowing that no answer would come from her body. No child would silence their fears. In their private chambers, where once laughter or whispers of tenderness had filled the air, silence grew thicker, as though each feared to wound the other by naming aloud what both already knew. The Shah remained devoted. He defended her against courtiers who dared suggest that he take another wife. He swore that his love for her outweighed the demands of tradition. He held her hand in public, kissed her cheek in private, and told her she was his only love. Yet even as he spoke, she must have sensed the fracture deepening. Could he truly deny his nation and heir? Could he turn away from centuries of monarchy, from the weight of ancestors whose thrones had been secured by bloodline? Each day he resisted. The burden grew heavier, pressing upon both their hearts. In the palace corridors, whispers multiplied. Ministers, cautious at first, became more insistent. Advisors reminded him of his father's legacy, of the fragility of a dynasty built upon one man alone. Foreign observers speculated. Diplomats hinted at instability. Everywhere the question of heirs hovered, like a shadow that lengthened with every passing year. Soraya, though shielded from the formal discussions, was not deaf to their echoes. She heard the change in voices, saw the glances exchanged behind her back, felt the growing tension in the air she breathed. To walk those halls was to walk among unspoken judgments, each step accompanied by the weight of what she could not give. And yet, through all this, their love did not vanish. Perhaps that was the greatest tragedy of all, that affection endured even as destiny drove them apart. He loved her still, perhaps more desperately for knowing he might lose her. She loved him too, though her love was mingled with grief, for she saw in his eyes the torment of a man torn between heart and crown. Their embraces grew longer, their silences more painful. In each kiss, perhaps they felt not promise but farewell, the awareness that soon even tenderness would not be enough. There were moments when hope flickered still. Doctors proposed further remedies, astrologers offered reassurances, and for brief seasons they clung to the possibility that fate might relent. Soraya submitted herself once more to examinations, to treatments, to prayers whispered in lonely hours. Each time she emerged weaker, more disheartened, her faith in miracles dimming. The Shah, too, must have felt the exhaustion of hope deferred, for even his strength faltered beneath the endless cycle of expectation and disappointment. Then came the inevitable moment when silence could no longer suffice. In a quiet chamber, perhaps in the same room where they had once shared tender dreams, the Shah told her what he could no longer withhold. He spoke with sorrow, not with anger. His words were not accusation, but lament. He told her that he could not deny his nation its future, that he could not resist the call of duty forever. To remain together was to risk the crown, to risk the empire itself. She listened in stillness, her heart breaking not because his love had faltered, but because love was no longer enough. Did she cry? Did she plead? Or did she, as some accounts suggest, bow her head in silence, accepting what she had long known would come? History does not record her exact words, for such moments belong not to public record, but to private memory. Yet one can imagine the stillness, the way her hand might have trembled as she released his, the way her eyes might have turned away so he would not see her tears. In that moment, two lives once bound together were quietly severed, not by anger, not by betrayal, but by the unyielding demands of destiny. The announcement of their separation came soon after. In Tehran, sorrow swept through the people like a morning wind. They had loved their queen, admired her beauty, cherished her presence. To hear that she would no longer be empress was to feel that a light had been extinguished. Women wept in the streets, men bowed their heads, newspapers printed her photograph with words of lament. She was called the Shah's lost love, the Queen of Hearts, the empress who had been cast aside by fate. Yet behind the public grief lay her private devastation, far deeper than any headline could capture. The Shah, too, wept. It is said that he confessed to his advisors that he had loved her more than any other, that losing her was the greatest sorrow of his life. But he signed the decree nonetheless, for he was king, and kings cannot rule with hearts alone. In choosing dynasty over love, he fulfilled his role as sovereign, but he carried the wound forever after. Soraya, meanwhile, prepared to leave the palace that had been her home, gathering her belongings with the quiet dignity that had always defined her. And so the unraveling of their marriage ended not with the clamor of conflict, but with the hush of sorrow. The corridors of the palace seemed emptier, the gardens quieter, the fountains lonelier. Soraya stepped once more into exile, her place beside the Shah taken not by another woman, but by silence itself. For though he would marry again, though heirs would later be born, none could replace the love they had lost. The echo of the palace gates closing behind her still lingered in the air, and from that sound grew the solemn announcement that spread across the nation. It was 1958 when the divorce of the Shah and Soraya was proclaimed, not as a whisper of rumor, but as official decree. The words, once spoken, moved swiftly through the corridors of government, into the newspapers, and across the radio waves that reached into every home in Iran. What had been private sorrow now became public grief. An empire, accustomed to seeing its sovereign and queen as a radiant pair, now faced the news that love had not survived the weight of dynasty. The statement was carefully crafted, formal, and restrained. It spoke of necessity, of sorrow, of destiny that could not be altered. No blame was laid upon Soraya, no accusation, no harsh word. Instead, it was framed as a tragedy of fate, a misfortune of nature that had denied them children. And yet, for all its politeness, the announcement was final, carrying the cold authority of law. For Soraya, those words sealed what her heart had already endured. She was no longer empress, no longer wife, no longer the queen who walked beside the Shah. In Tehran, grief spread like a shadow across the city. Women wept openly in the streets, their tears falling not only for their queen but for themselves, for they saw in her story a reflection of love, undone by forces too great for the heart to conquer. Men bowed their heads in sorrow, their voices subdued in tea houses and markets. Children who had known her only as the beautiful figure in photographs asked why the queen was leaving and received no answer they could understand. The nation mourned not only the end of a marriage, but the loss of a dream. The fairy tale that had seemed to promise renewal, now shattered by the unyielding weight of reality. Crowds gathered near the palace, silent and respectful, watching as the woman they loved prepared to depart. She did not linger, did not falter. Dressed in black, her eyes shielded by dark glasses, she stepped into the waiting car with the grace that had always defined her. The people watched, some reaching out their hands in blessing, others clasping their palms in sorrow. She did not wave, for her heart was too heavy, but she carried their grief with her as she left. The palace that had once been her home, filled with music and ceremony, now receded into distance, its marble walls glimmering faintly in the morning light. The Shah, for his part, remained within, his sorrow hidden from public gaze. Yet it is said that he wept openly in private, his heart torn by the loss of the woman he loved most deeply. To rule is to sacrifice, and this sacrifice was greater than any he had made before. Though he would marry again, though he would father children, he would later confess that none had touched his heart as Soraya had. Their love, though defeated by destiny, endured as memory, a wound that never fully healed. For Soraya, exile began not with freedom, but with emptiness. The aircraft that carried her away lifted into the skies of Tehran under a hush of mourning. The people below watched in silence, their eyes following the small shape of the plane as it vanished into the horizon. Within the cabin, she sat by the window once more, her reflection faint upon the glass. This time there was no promise of return, no hope of restoration. Behind her lay Iran, her homeland, her throne, her marriage. Ahead lay only uncertainty, a life in Europe where she would no longer be queen but a woman alone. In Paris, in Rome, in Munich, the newspapers greeted her arrival with fascination. She was no longer the Queen of Iran, but she was still the Shah's lost empress, a figure of beauty and tragedy. Photographers crowded around her, their cameras capturing her slender figure, her luminous eyes, her poised but sorrowful smile. To the world she remained glamorous, elegant, enchanting. But beneath the surface shimmer lay the quiet truth. She was a woman uprooted, torn from her place, adrift in a world that admired her image yet could not touch her solitude. She carried with her jewels, gowns, the remnants of her life as queen. But these were not treasures to her. They were reminders, heavy with memory. Each diamond, each silk garment, each photograph spoke of what had been lost. In hotel rooms and apartments, she unpacked her belongings carefully, arranging them as though to recreate a semblance of home. Yet no arrangement could replace the palace gardens, the scent of roses at dusk, the sound of fountains murmuring in the night. Exile, no matter how gilded, remained exile. And yet, even in her sorrow, she endured with dignity. She appeared at society events, her beauty once more drawing admiration. She walked the boulevards of Paris with quiet grace, her presence turning heads. She dined in Roman cafes, her laughter faint but genuine when in the company of friends. To the outside world, she seemed to embrace her new life, to embody the resilience of a woman who had lost much, but not her elegance. But within, the silence remained. For though she could adorn herself with jewels, she could not adorn the emptiness of her heart. It is in such contrasts that her tragedy lies. She was loved by her people, adored by her husband, admired by the world. Yet none of these could protect her from the hand of fate that denied her children, denied her role, denied her the simple joy of a life lived without judgment. She became instead a figure of beauty touched by sorrow, forever remembered not for what she had, but for what she lost. The petals of the rose trembled beneath her touch, and when at last they fell, they seemed to mark the beginning of another season in her life. The silence of her Paris apartment gave way to the murmur of boulevards, the glow of cafes, the flashing lights of photographers who had not forgotten her face. Though no longer empress, Soraya became again a figure of fascination, her presence turning the streets of Europe into a stage upon which her beauty and sorrow played together in quiet harmony. Paris embraced her first. Along the Champs-Élysées, where carriages had once rolled and now sleek automobiles hummed, she walked with measured steps, her tall frame draped in couture that drew admiring glances. Society women studied her gowns, columnists compared her to film stars, and strangers turned their heads as she passed. Yet beneath the glamour lay melancholy, as though every glance of admiration were also a reminder that she was admired now not as queen, but as the queen who had been lost. Her laughter in salons was soft, polite, restrained, never spilling over into joy. Those who sat close to her spoke later of her luminous eyes that seemed always to gaze at something beyond the room, as though she carried within her a secret horizon that no one else could see. Rome, too, welcomed her, its piazzas and cafes offering a different kind of solace. Here she could sit at a small table beneath the shade of awnings, sipping espresso while the hum of voices rose around her. Artists and actors sometimes joined her, drawn by her aura. She conversed with elegance, her German and French fluent, her Persian softened by distance. Photographers captured her in these moments, cigarette in hand, a faint smile on her lips, her beauty untouched by sorrow, yet undeniably marked by it. The Italian newspapers called her La Principessa Triste, the sad princess, an epithet that followed her wherever she went. In Munich, where she sometimes stayed with her family, life was quieter. There she could walk without as much scrutiny, spending evenings with her brother Bijan, whose companionship offered her a thread of home. Yet even there, among familiar voices, she remained suspended between worlds. She was no longer of Iran, though Iran lived within her heart. She was not fully European, though Europe embraced her with open arms. She was both celebrated and displaced, both adorned and exiled, both radiant and alone. And so her life became a pattern of appearances and withdrawals. At times, she would step into the glitter of society, her presence commanding attention, her gowns photographed, her beauty admired. Then, just as suddenly, she would retreat into solitude, her apartments dimly lit, her windows closed, her letters unanswered. This rhythm reflected the duality within her, the desire to live, to be seen, to be remembered, and the equal desire to vanish, to dissolve into silence where sorrow could rest unobserved. In those years, she became less a woman of action and more a symbol. To many, she represented the fragility of beauty, the tragedy of love undone by duty, the mystery of a queen cast into exile. Admirers saw in her the embodiment of romantic melancholy, a figure both untouchable and vulnerable. Some sought her hand, drawn to her allure, hoping perhaps to heal her wounds with their affection. But each romance, if it flowered at all, faded quickly, for none could erase the shadow that lingered behind her eyes. The Shah, though far away, remained always in her memory, not as sovereign, but as the man who had loved her most deeply. How could any other hope to replace him? Her fashion, her style, her presence, all carried a note of nostalgia. Even as she attended events, she seemed slightly apart, as though she walked through them as one walks through a dream already half forgotten. People spoke of her dignity, of her quiet voice, of the way she smiled without revealing too much. To be near her was to feel the presence of history itself, as though she carried within her the echo of palaces, the hush of royal chambers, the sorrow of a throne abandoned. And yet, one must ask, was she content in these years, or was she merely enduring? Did the glow of Parisian nights and Roman afternoons offer her true solace, or only distraction? Did the admiration of strangers heal the wound of exile, or did it deepen it by reminding her constantly of what she had been? The answer remains uncertain, for Soraya herself seldom revealed the depth of her heart. She spoke little of her past, offering only fragments, leaving those around her to wonder at the silences between her words. What is certain is that exile, however adorned, carried loneliness. To leave one's homeland is to leave not only places, but also the invisible threads that tie a soul to its people, its soil, its sky. Though Soraya could walk the avenues of Paris and Rome with elegance, though she could sit among artists and aristocrats, she remained in some sense rootless, like a rose cut from its garden, admired for its beauty, yet destined to fade without the soil that nourished it. Her beauty, too, became a paradox. It sustained her in the eyes of the world, ensuring her presence remained admired, ensuring her memory was not forgotten. But it also imprisoned her, for people saw in her face a fairy tale, a story of glamour and tragedy, and seldom looked deeper to see the woman within. To them, she was the lost empress, the tragic beauty. But to herself, she was perhaps only Soraya, a woman who had once loved, once hoped, once dreamed of children's laughter in gardens, and now walked alone among strangers who could not truly know her. The twilight glow of the Roman cafe lingered in her eyes as she set the empty cup back upon its saucer, and from that quiet moment of pause, we moved toward another chapter of her exile, one that shimmered with possibility yet dissolved into disappointment. For in those years, surrounded by admirers and pursued by photographers, Soraya was drawn into the world of cinema, that strange realm of shadows and light where stories are told through faces and gestures. Perhaps it seemed to her a way to transform the narrative that had already been written upon her life, to step beyond the title of queen in exile, and to become, instead, an actress, a figure in her own right. Perhaps it offered her a promise of reinvention, a chance to shape destiny anew. It was in the late 1960s when the Italian director Franco Indovina persuaded her to appear in his film Three Faces of a Woman. The project, ambitious and experimental, sought to explore the complexities of feminine identity through shifting perspectives. For Soraya, it was both an opportunity and a risk. She had never studied acting, never trained her voice for the stage, never learned to dissolve herself into another's story. Yet she carried within her the allure of presence, the kind of aura that could command attention even without words. Indovina believed that aura could translate to the screen, and the world, still enchanted by her beauty, waited with curiosity. Filming began, and with it came the rituals of a new world. Makeup applied in dimly lit rooms, costumes tailored, cameras set upon tracks, crew members moving silently around her. Soraya stepped into the set, the lights hot upon her face, the director's voice guiding her gestures. She spoke lines, she moved through scenes, she attempted to become someone other than herself. Yet here lay the paradox. For though she was playing a character, she could not shed the weight of her own history. The camera captured not simply the role, but the queen in exile, the sorrow behind her eyes, the dignity in her posture. She could not pretend, for she had lived too deeply. Every glance, every word carried within it the echo of her past. The critics, when the film was released, were not kind. They spoke of her beauty, yes, but dismissed her performance as stiff, her presence too controlled, her emotions too guarded. They judged her not as a woman trying, but as a queen attempting to cross into an art she did not master. The film itself faded quickly, remembered more for the curiosity of her involvement than for its merit. For Soraya, it was a wound, not because she sought fame, but because she had hoped, perhaps, that art could offer her release from the shadow of her story. Instead, it reminded her that she could never escape herself. One wonders what she felt in those hours of filming, under the glaring lights, surrounded by strangers who looked upon her not as empress, but as actress. Did she feel free, as though she had stepped into a world where crowns and dynasties were meaningless? Or did she feel trapped, as though every attempt to become another person only led her back to the truth of who she was? Did she laugh when the camera stopped, or did she retreat into silence, aware that she was trying to step into a role that could never truly be hers? Her brief career in cinema ended almost as soon as it began. She did not seek other roles, did not pursue acting further. Perhaps she understood that the stage was not her realm, that her life itself was already a performance larger than any screenplay. Perhaps she realized that no character could be more haunting, more tragic, more unforgettable than the character she had already been forced to play, the Shah's lost empress. And so, she returned to the shadows of exile, her foray into cinema, a footnote, a fragment, a fleeting attempt to reimagine herself. Yet even in failure, there was dignity. She did not lament publicly, did not protest the critics, did not attempt to justify herself. She accepted the verdict with the same grace with which she had accepted the loss of her throne. In silence, she withdrew, allowing the film to fade, allowing her own image to remain not as actress, but as the enigmatic figure the world already knew. For Soraya's essence lay not in playing roles, but in being herself, fragile, luminous, sorrowful, unforgettable. Still, the attempt revealed something of her inner longing. To step into cinema was to reach toward expression, to seek a way to give form to the emotions she seldom voiced. Perhaps she had hoped that through acting she could release her grief, transform her sorrow into art. Perhaps she sought to prove, if only to herself, that she was more than exile, more than beauty, more than tragedy. That she did not succeed does not diminish the attempt. It shows instead the depth of her desire to be more than what destiny had decreed. And so, the cafes of Rome once more welcomed her, the salons of Paris once more glittered with her presence, the photographers once more pursued her steps. She returned to her life as she had lived it before, admired and alone, her attempt at reinvention now folded back into the greater story of her existence. The film reels gathered dust, the critics forgot her, but the people did not. To them, she remained Soraya, the woman whose life was itself a story too profound for cinema to capture. The flickering light of the cinema still danced across her face, and when the reel at last spun to its end, the screen fell dark, leaving her again in silence. From that darkness emerged another chapter of her exile, one not written in scripts or ceremonies, but in the fragile language of the heart. For though Soraya's crown had been taken, though her role as empress had dissolved, she was still a woman whose beauty drew admirers, whose presence ignited the longings of men, and whose loneliness opened the possibility of love. Yet here, too, fate showed its heavy hand, for every romance that touched her life in exile was fleeting, shadowed, incomplete. Among the figures who drew near her in those years were men of wealth, of art, of nobility. Some were captivated by her elegance, seeing in her not only beauty but also the aura of mystery that surrounded a queen undone by destiny. Others sought to rescue her, imagining that their devotion might heal the wound left by the Shah. Still others were drawn to the glamour of her name, the allure of being close to a woman the world had once called Empress. She entertained their company with grace, accepted their attentions with quiet composure, and at times allowed her heart to lean toward theirs. But always, between her and them, there hovered another presence, the memory of the Shah, the love that had been severed yet not extinguished. It is said that she was courted by princes and counts, by actors and industrialists. Handsome faces, charming words, glittering gifts, all were offered to her. She smiled, she listened, she walked arm in arm through gardens or down boulevards. But within her heart the echo of another hand, another gaze, remained. For love, once rooted so deeply, cannot be replaced by new blossoms, however radiant. Soraya carried her first love like a secret jewel hidden within her, untouchable, unyielding, and it rendered every other affection pale in comparison. There was tenderness, yes, in some of these affairs. She was not stone, and moments of companionship must have warmed her in the cold of exile. There were evenings spent in quiet laughter, mornings of shared conversation, perhaps even the touch of intimacy that reminded her she was still desired, still alive. Yet these moments dissolved as quickly as they appeared. Suitors departed, romances faded, promises broke. Some were frightened by her sorrow, unable to bear the depth of her melancholy. Others were drawn elsewhere, their devotion too shallow to endure. And Soraya, for her part, could never fully surrender. For how can one give the heart wholly to another when a part of it still belongs to the man one has lost? Perhaps the most lasting of her relationships was with Franco Indovina, the Italian director who had coaxed her into the realm of cinema. Their companionship grew beyond film, blossoming into affection that seemed, for a time, to offer her a fragile happiness. With him, she found not only admiration but understanding, for he saw in her not merely beauty or tragedy, but a woman of thought, of sensitivity, of quiet strength. He cherished her with tenderness, and for a brief season she allowed herself to hope. Yet fate, relentless as ever, intervened once more. In 1972, Indovina died tragically in a plane crash, his life cut short, his promise to her broken not by choice, but by the cruelty of chance. Soraya was devastated, her grief compounded by the echo of her earlier loss. Once again, love had been offered and taken from her, leaving her more alone than before. This pattern repeated itself in quieter ways. Rumors of engagement surfaced in newspapers, whispers of romances circled through salons, but none endured. Some were true, some imagined, but all shared the same fate: transience. The world, always eager for stories of royalty and love, painted her as the eternal tragic heroine, the woman who could not hold onto happiness. And though such portrayals may have been exaggerated, they were not without foundation. For Soraya herself, love became less a promise than a reminder of impermanence. How must it have felt to be desired by many and yet unable to be fulfilled by any? To receive bouquets of roses, to walk in moonlit gardens, to hear words of devotion whispered into the night, and yet to know that none of it would last. Was it consolation, or was it torment to be admired and yet never truly claimed? Did she ever believe, in the quiet of her solitude, that love might return to her in lasting form? Or did she, after Indovina's death, resign herself to the truth that she would always walk alone? In these affairs, one sees again the duality of her life. She was at once luminous and untouchable, desired and yet unattainable. Men sought her, but what they found was not only beauty but also sorrow, and sorrow cannot be easily embraced. She gave of herself sparingly, protecting the fragile core of her heart, never allowing another to wound her as deeply as the first parting had done. In this way, she lived both as participant and as ghost, present in the arms of others, yet absent in the fullness of her soul. As years passed, her romances became fewer, her solitude greater. Admirers still lingered, still wrote, still offered themselves, but Soraya's responses grew more distant. She had lived long enough to know the fragility of promises, the inevitability of endings. Love, she may have decided, was a gift the fates had granted her once and taken away. To seek it again was to invite sorrow once more, and her heart, weary from wounds, preferred silence to repetition. The night air upon the Roman balcony carried her sigh into silence, and as she set the photograph aside, she leaned back into her chair, her gaze dissolving into the distance where lights met darkness. From that quiet horizon, we step now into the long reflections that shaped her later exile. For Soraya lived not only as a woman among suitors and friends, but as one haunted by the paradox of her identity. She had lost a throne, yet she remained forever a queen in memory, bound to a title she no longer bore, wandering between the shimmering luxury of European salons and the echoing solitude of her private rooms. In the eyes of the world, she was never simply Soraya. She was always the Shah's lost empress, the woman whose beauty had graced palaces, whose sorrow had captured hearts across continents. In newspapers, in whispered conversations, in the photographs that followed her steps, her name was bound always to her former crown. She was admired not only for who she was, but for what she had been, for the story of grandeur undone by fate. This admiration brought her invitations, opened doors to gatherings, and ensured that she remained luminous even in exile. Yet it also imprisoned her, for she could never step beyond the shadow of her past. To walk into a Parisian salon was for her to walk into a hall of mirrors. Guests would rise, voices hushed with awe, eyes lingering upon her gown, her poise, her smile. They spoke to her with reverence, but beneath their words lay always the unspoken thought. Here was the queen without a throne, the empress undone. She responded with dignity, her voice soft, her manner gracious, but within she must have felt the dissonance. For though she lived in apartments adorned with fine furniture, though she wore jewels that sparkled beneath chandeliers, though she dined upon silver and crystal, she was not of these places. She was a guest everywhere, at home nowhere. Her existence drifted between cities, between hotels, between gatherings. Paris offered its boulevards, Rome its piazzas, Munich its quieter streets, but none could root her fully. She belonged everywhere and nowhere, a figure admired, yet untethered. Friends invited her to their estates. Admirers offered her company. Strangers bowed to her in recognition. And yet each night she returned to solitude. For even among crowds, even in the glitter of society, she carried within her the silence of exile, the emptiness of one who has been cut off from the soil of belonging. And yet she did not collapse beneath this burden. She carried herself with dignity, as though determined that sorrow would not mar her outward grace. She dressed with elegance, spoke with courtesy, moved with the composure of royalty. Even in solitude, she preserved rituals of refinement. She drank tea from porcelain. She wrote letters upon fine stationery. She arranged flowers in crystal vases. These small acts were her way of sustaining the memory of her queenship, of affirming that though she had been dethroned, she had not been diminished. To lose a crown is not to lose the dignity of bearing, and Soraya bore herself always as though the crown still rested invisibly upon her brow. Yet inwardly, reflections deepened. She spoke little of her past, but those who knew her said that she often drifted into silence, her eyes distant, her thoughts turned inward. Did she ponder what her life might have been? Had fate been kinder? Did she imagine herself still in the palace gardens, surrounded by children, walking beside the Shah into old age? Or did she resign herself to the truth that some lives are written as tragedies, shaped less by what they achieve than by what they lose? Such questions, unanswered, linger in the spaces between her words, in the pauses of her conversations, in the quiet sighs she released upon lonely nights. What does it mean to be remembered not for one's deeds, but for one's sorrows? Soraya must have asked herself this, for she knew that the world admired her not for triumph, but for tragedy. She was the emblem of lost love, the symbol of wasted grandeur, the woman whose story evoked pity as much as admiration. Was this legacy enough? Or did she long to be remembered not as victim but as person, not as symbol but as soul? These questions perhaps pressed upon her most in the hours of solitude, when the lights of salons faded and the hum of conversation gave way to silence. In those silences, she turned often to memory. The gardens of Isfahan, the snowy winters of Berlin, the palace corridors of Tehran, all returned to her like fragments of a dream. She held them gently, turning them over in her mind, as though seeking to piece together a mosaic of belonging. Yet the mosaic remained incomplete, for she was no longer fully of any place. Her homeland had closed its gates behind her. Europe embraced her, but never fully claimed her. And even within her own family she remained apart, set apart by the weight of her history. And so her life in exile became less a journey forward than a circling, a drifting between places, between identities, between selves. She was both Soraya and the Empress, both woman and symbol, both participant in life and spectator of it. She inhabited a twilight realm, neither entirely within the world nor outside it, luminous yet shadowed, admired yet alone. Her hand hovered before the mirror, not quite touching, her reflection layered in silence. From that image, we pass into another realm of her life, one that bound her still to the earth even as she drifted in exile, the bonds of family. For though Soraya was celebrated by strangers and admired by society, the voices that reached deepest into her solitude were those of kin, those who carried within them the same threads of memory, of homeland, of childhood. Chief among them was her younger brother, Bijan, whose companionship became for her both anchor and reminder, both solace and sorrow. In her years of wandering between Paris, Rome, and Munich, Bijan was often near. He was not only brother, but guardian, a presence steady and protective in the shifting landscapes of her exile. Where others saw only the queen undone, he saw the sister who had once run through the courtyards of Isfahan, who had endured the cold winters of Berlin beside him, who had laughed with him before thrones and titles had altered their lives. His presence reminded her that beneath the crown, beneath the exiled grandeur, she was still Soraya, a woman of family, of blood, of ordinary bonds. They walked together often through gardens, along city streets, in quiet parks where no cameras intruded. Bijan listened to her silences, asked little, demanded nothing. He did not press upon her the burden of explanation, nor did he seek to draw out confessions she did not wish to give. Instead, he offered companionship that required no performance, no mask, no pretense. With him, she could sit in silence and feel understood. In his voice, she heard echoes of her father, of her Persian roots, of a lineage that tied her still to the land she had left. In his laughter, she felt again the faint warmth of family, a warmth that neither exile nor sorrow could extinguish. Their relationship was not without tension, for Bijan, though protective, also carried his own burdens, his own sense of displacement, his own longing for the homeland that had cast them adrift. At times, their conversations turned to Iran, to memories of Isfahan, to the scents and sounds of a world that remained vivid in their hearts, but distant in reality. They spoke of their father's service, of their mother's German heritage, of the blending of cultures that had shaped their childhood. In these talks, nostalgia mingled with grief, for each memory was also a reminder of loss, of what could never be regained. And yet, even sorrow shared became a form of solace, for in speaking together of Iran, they preserved it, kept it alive within themselves, ensured that it did not vanish entirely into exile. Soraya, who so seldom spoke of her past with others, could open fragments of it with Bijan, trusting that he would understand without judgment, without pity. He was her companion not in glamour but in grief, not in ceremony but in solitude. His loyalty was steady, unwavering, a light that did not dazzle but endured. Beyond Bijan, there were other ties of family that sustained her, though more distantly. Cousins, relatives, connections to the Bakhtiari clan, these threads stretched across continents, sometimes close, sometimes faint. They reminded her that she was not rootless, that her blood carried the weight of tribes, of nobility, of Persian history. Yet family, too, was fragmented by exile, scattered across Europe and beyond, each living their own version of displacement. Gatherings were rare, often tinged with melancholy, for though they shared lineage, they also shared the wound of distance. Still, in the quiet of her apartments, family letters arrived, handwriting familiar, words intimate, speaking of small details, of daily life, of shared memory. She read them slowly, tracing the lines with her eyes as though each letter connected her back to something solid, something beyond the shifting images of exile. In these letters, she was not empress, not symbol, but simply Soraya, sister, cousin, kin. Such reminders, though small, offered her the sense that she was still part of something larger than herself, that she belonged not only to the world's gaze, but to a circle of voices who loved her without condition. Yet even here, shadows lingered. For family ties can comfort, but they can also remind one of what is missing. Bijan, devoted as he was, could not heal the wound of her solitude, nor could he fill the emptiness of a life without children, without a home to pass down to another generation. When she looked at her brother, did she see also the absence of the children she herself would never bear, the family she would never create? Did she wonder if her line, her story, would vanish with her, remembered only in headlines and photographs, not in the lives of descendants? Such thoughts must have pressed upon her in quiet hours, deepening her sense of being both remembered and forgotten, both present and absent in the story of her people. And yet family remained her truest refuge. When admirers faded, when romances dissolved, when society's admiration grew tiring, it was Bijan who remained, steady as stone. He accompanied her in travels, stood beside her in legal disputes, comforted her in illness. When she faltered, he steadied her. When she despaired, he reminded her of her worth. To him, she was not merely the Shah's lost empress, but sister, companion, soul bound by blood. His devotion did not erase her loneliness, but it softened it, reminding her that she was not entirely alone. In the end, exile is not only distance from homeland, but distance from belonging. For Soraya, family was the bridge that kept her from drifting entirely into solitude, the thread that tied her back to her origins. Without Bijan, perhaps her sorrow would have consumed her entirely. With him, she endured, carried forward, sustained by the simple truth that one voice, one presence, can anchor even the most wandering soul. The damp mist of the Munich streets clung to her coat as she walked beside her brother, and in that gray silence, her thoughts drifted further than the pavement beneath her feet. They turned eastward across mountains and deserts, toward the land she had left behind, the homeland that had once crowned her and then cast her aside. From those distant horizons rose the image of Iran under the Shah, a nation in transformation, reshaped by ambition and modernity, while she, its former queen, remained unchanged in exile, a shadow watching from afar. News of Iran reached her in fragments. Newspapers spread across café tables in Paris, conversations overheard at soirées in Rome, letters from relatives still bound to the homeland. She read of highways stretching across landscapes where once caravans had moved slowly through dust, of schools rising in villages where children had once studied by lamplight, of factories humming with the rhythm of modern progress. She saw photographs of Tehran where skyscrapers pierced the sky, where neon lights shimmered above streets now crowded with cars instead of donkeys. She read of women unveiled, of new freedoms and restrictions, of the clash between tradition and modernity. Each report carried her back to the palace halls she had once walked, the councils she had overheard, the dreams her husband had spoken to her in moments of intimacy. She remembered how he would describe the Iran he wished to build, an Iran strong, respected, radiant among nations. And now, though she was no longer by his side, she saw those dreams unfolding. Pride and sorrow mingled within her, pride that the man she had loved was shaping his country with determination, sorrow that she was no longer part of the vision, that her name had been erased from the story being written upon the land. In gatherings abroad, she was often asked of Iran. Strangers, journalists, acquaintances would turn to her, eager for her perspective. "What do you think of the Shah's reforms?" they asked. "How do you see the changes in your homeland?" She answered with grace, always with dignity, never with bitterness. She spoke with affection of Iran's beauty, of its people, of its traditions. But she did not linger long upon the questions, for to speak too much was to awaken grief. Her voice was soft, her words measured, her eyes distant. For though she could comment upon the surface, her heart remained bound to what she had lost, not policies or reforms, but the intimacy of belonging. Did she feel envy toward the woman who had replaced her, the new queen who now stood at the Shah's side, who bore him children, who shared the role that had once been hers? Perhaps she did, though she concealed it with dignity. More likely, she felt sorrow rather than envy, a sorrow born not of rivalry, but of displacement. For Soraya had not been supplanted by another in the Shah's heart. He had confessed often, even in later years, that she remained his true love. But she had been replaced in the story of Iran, in the dynasty, in the continuity of crown. To see another woman bear the heirs she could not give must have pierced her deeply, even as she knew it was inevitable. From afar, she watched Iran's transformation not as participant, but as witness. She was like a figure at the edge of a painting, her presence felt but not seen, her influence erased though her memory endured, for the people of Iran had not forgotten her. In bazaars and homes, in whispered conversations, her name lingered still. She was remembered with tenderness, with pity, with admiration. Many said she had been the Shah's true love, the queen of their hearts. Yet these whispers could not cross into her exile, could not warm her in the solitude of her apartments. They remained only echoes, faint and far, drifting upon winds she could not feel. In her solitude, she must have wondered, had fate been different? Would she have stood beside the Shah through these transformations, sharing in the triumphs, enduring the burdens? Would she have walked with him through the streets of a modernizing Tehran, greeting crowds, blessing schools, inaugurating hospitals? Would she have held in her arms the children who would one day inherit the throne? These questions must have returned to her again and again, not as sharp grief, but as quiet ache, the ache of a life that might have been. And yet, even as she pondered, she remained suspended in time. While Iran surged forward, Soraya seemed untouched by years. Her beauty lingered, her presence unchanged, as though exile itself preserved her in amber. She did not grow into new roles, did not become matron or mother, did not evolve into another identity. She remained always the lost empress, the woman of sorrowful grace, the figure frozen in memory. This stillness was both blessing and curse. Blessing because she remained luminous, curse because she remained trapped, unable to move beyond the image that defined her. There is a question here, subtle and haunting. Is it better to be remembered as one once was, forever radiant, or to grow and change with time at the cost of fading? Soraya did not choose her stillness, but it became her fate. She walked through Paris salons and Roman cafes unchanged, admired as though years had not touched her. Yet within, time moved on, sorrow deepened, loneliness grew. She lived in the present, but she remained bound to the past, her identity always tied to what she had once been. The folded newspaper rested upon the table like a closed chapter, and from its silence we move forward into a time when all the pages of that dynasty were torn apart. For in 1979, the land she had once called home, the empire she had once served as queen, erupted in upheaval. From afar, in her Paris apartment, Soraya watched as the Shah's power crumbled, as the throne itself dissolved beneath the tide of revolution. The world she had been cast from decades earlier was now collapsing, and though she was no longer part of it, the fall pierced her heart as though it had been her own. News reached her in fragments once again, but this time the fragments came with urgency, with sorrow, with finality. She saw images of protests flooding the streets of Tehran, voices raised not in adoration but in anger. She read of strikes, of unrest, of the people's fury against the monarchy that had once seemed so immovable. She saw photographs of women marching, of men shouting, of banners lifted against the very crown that had once rested upon her head, and she knew then, with a clarity as sharp as pain, that an era was ending. When she saw the Shah fleeing with his family, leaving Iran for the last time, did her heart not tremble? He had once been her husband, her beloved, the man she had lost to duty. Now he too was lost, not to her alone, but to his nation, to his throne, to the very destiny that had once torn them apart. Exile had been her fate long before his, but now he joined her in that realm of dislocation, though on a scale far greater. She must have wondered, in the quiet of her apartment, whether he thought of her then, whether he recalled that first departure when she had left Tehran with silent sorrow. Did he remember how she had wept behind dark glasses, as now perhaps he wept behind the walls of his final journeys? For Soraya, the fall of the monarchy was not triumph, nor vindication, nor even bitter satisfaction. It was grief of another kind, the grief of seeing erase not only her own past, but the legacy of a nation. She had once been bound to that dynasty, her name written into its story, and though she had been cut away, its destruction still cut her. To watch the crown fall was to watch her own memories collapse. The palaces she had walked turned to relics. The gardens she had loved left untended. The empire she had once called home dissolved into silence. Perhaps she felt compassion for the Shah's last queen, Farah, who now bore the same exile that Soraya had endured alone for so many years. Perhaps she felt kinship, knowing that though their paths had been different, their fates were now entwined in displacement. Perhaps, too, she felt sorrow for the children, heirs to a throne that no longer existed, carrying titles that had become ghosts. For Soraya, who had once been blamed for the absence of heirs, this irony must have struck deep. The heirs, when they finally came, were themselves denied the inheritance for which she had been cast aside. The Shah's death in 1980 closed another chapter. Far from Iran, in a foreign land, the man she had loved most deeply breathed his last, not upon a throne but in exile, his crown reduced to memory. Soraya mourned him quietly, privately, for though they had long been separated, their bond had never fully broken. He had loved her. She had loved him, and no divorce, no distance, no other marriage could erase that truth. When she heard the news, she must have closed her eyes and seen him again as he had been in youth, his hand reaching for hers, his gaze tender, his voice full of promises they could not keep. She did not attend his funeral, but she carried him in her heart, and perhaps in her solitude, she whispered prayers for his soul. What did she feel then, as she looked back upon the years? Did she wonder whether fate might have been kinder had they remained together, even without children? Did she imagine that their love, had it endured, might have softened his exile, might have given him comfort in his final days? Or did she accept, with the resignation that had long defined her, that destiny had already written their parting, and nothing could have altered the outcome? These questions must have turned within her like restless birds fluttering against the silence of her solitude. For Iran itself, the years that followed brought transformation beyond what she could have imagined. The monarchy was gone, the palaces no longer resonated with the steps of royalty, the empire of her youth was dissolved into the Republic of Revolution. From Europe, she watched as her homeland shifted beyond recognition, as the voices of the past were silenced, as the gardens of her memory grew ever more distant. She could not return, she could not claim, she could not belong. She remained always at the threshold, gazing inward from afar, her heart tethered to a land she would never walk again. And yet, she did not fade from memory. In Iran, her name lingered in whispers, in stories told by the old to the young, in photographs kept hidden, in sighs released at dusk. She was remembered as the Queen of Hearts, the lost Empress, the woman who had been loved most truly by the Shah. Though history moved on, her image endured, not erased but softened into legend. And in Europe, too, she remained admired, her elegance still noted, her presence still magnetic. She had lost much, but she had not been forgotten. She stood before the window, her silhouette framed by the lights of Paris, and when at last she drew the curtains closed, the glow of the city dissolved into shadow. From that stillness we move into the quiet corridors of her later years, when age began to settle gently upon her, when beauty lingered but was touched now with the fragility of passing time. Soraya, once radiant as a bride, once luminous as a queen, once admired as an exile, now found herself entering a season of life where mirrors became companions, where solitude deepened, and where the silence of rooms seemed to stretch longer than ever before. Her beauty had been her gift, her emblem, her prison. Even as years passed, she remained striking, her tall frame graceful, her dark hair touched only lightly with silver, her eyes retaining the same luminous depth that had captivated the Shah in their youth. Admirers continued to remark upon it, photographers still sought to capture it, and strangers still turned their heads when she entered a room. Yet beauty, in later years, carries another weight. It becomes not only a source of admiration, but a reminder of what has been lost. Each glance into the mirror brought her face to her own eyes, and within that face, she saw not only who she was, but who she had been. The mirror grew into a quiet witness of her days. In the mornings, as she dressed, she looked upon her reflection with the dignity of one who knows she must still present herself with grace. In the evenings, as lamps glowed softly in her apartment, she gazed again, searching not for vanity but for memory. The mirror reflected her still as beautiful, but within her eyes she saw the shadows of gardens left behind, of palaces abandoned, of love lost. To the world she was timeless. To herself, she was both timeless and bound to time. Aging in exile is not the same as aging in home. For those who age in home, there are familiar voices, familiar streets, the comfort of continuity. For Soraya, there was only drifting. She moved between Paris and Rome, sometimes Munich, her addresses shifting, her apartments changing, her routes shallow. Each new place was adorned with familiar objects, photographs, jewels, porcelain, books, but none could replace the sense of belonging. She aged without homeland, without children, without permanence. Her life was like a series of hotel rooms, each beautiful, each temporary, each filled with silence when the door closed behind her. Her friends, too, grew fewer with time. Some passed away, others drifted into their own lives, and the gatherings of salons became less frequent. She was still invited, still admired, but she appeared less often, preferring solitude. For solitude, though painful, became her most faithful companion. In solitude, she could remember without interruption, could drift into the past without having to explain herself, could sigh without being asked why. Solitude, though heavy, offered her the dignity of privacy, the right to carry her sorrow without spectacle. Letters arrived still, from family, from old acquaintances, from admirers who remembered her youth. She read them with patience, replied with grace, her handwriting still elegant upon fine paper. Yet even letters began to feel like echoes, for many who wrote did so out of nostalgia, out of longing for the queen she had been rather than the woman she was. She bore this with composure, never rebuking, never showing bitterness. But she must have felt the distance between how the world remembered her and how she lived, to be seen as symbol when one longs to be seen as self. That is, a loneliness few can bear. Her health, fragile since youth, weakened further. Illness returned in cycles, bringing with it fatigue, faintness, moments of vulnerability. Physicians visited her rooms, prescribing remedies, urging rest, offering reassurances. But no medicine could heal the wound of exile. No tonic could restore the belonging she had lost. She bore her ailments quietly, seldom speaking of them, preserving always the outward image of grace. Yet in private, When pain pressed heavily upon her, when weakness stole her strength, she must have looked once more into the mirror and asked herself how much longer she would endure. And yet, even as her body weakened, her dignity endured. She continued to dress with care, to walk with composure, to speak with gentleness. She continued to cultivate beauty in her surroundings, flowers arranged in vases, curtains drawn just so, books stacked neatly upon tables. These small gestures were her way of resisting decline, her way of affirming that though time could touch her body, it could not strip her of grace. In this, she revealed a quiet strength, the strength of endurance, of preserving dignity even in sorrow, of holding herself as queen even when the crown was long gone. Her memories, too, grew sharper as years passed. She remembered the Shah, always with tenderness. She remembered their first meeting, their wedding, their love, their parting. She remembered the palace gardens, the sound of fountains, the laughter of courtiers, the silence of nights. She remembered her exile, her travels, her failed attempts at cinema, her fleeting romances, her griefs. Memory became her realm, the kingdom she ruled still, though it was made only of shadows and echoes. In memory, she was still empress, still beloved, still radiant. In memory, she could walk again through Isfahan, through Tehran, through the halls of Sadabad. Memory was at once her refuge and her torment, for it gave her back what life had taken, yet only in form, never in flesh. And so, her later years unfolded like slow twilight, not abrupt, not violent, but gentle, dimming gradually, each day a little quieter, each night a little longer. The world around her changed, new fashions, new politics, new voices. But she remained unchanged, as though time had circled around her without carrying her forward. She lived in the present, but she belonged to the past. Her name still appeared in headlines now and then, her photographs still resurfaced, but she herself drifted further into obscurity, known only to those who sought her deliberately. She became less a person in the world's eyes than a figure of memory, a story told with sighs, a legend recounted in whispers. The clock ticked softly in the lamplight, steady and indifferent, its sound marking each passing second in her silent room. From that patient rhythm, we move into another chapter of Soraya's twilight, one where the passage of time was not measured only in age but in diminishing means. For though she had once been crowned with jewels that glimmered like stars, once surrounded by silks and treasures, the years of exile gradually consumed her wealth. Piece by piece, the relics of her life as queen slipped from her grasp, leaving her with fewer possessions, fewer securities, fewer illusions. What had once been an empire around her now dwindled into fragments sold, each carrying away not only value but memory. At first, the change was subtle. She lived in fine apartments, still dressed with elegance, still maintained the outward aura of refinement. Visitors would not have known, at least not immediately, that her resources had begun to wane, for she guarded her dignity fiercely, never allowing her decline to become spectacle. Yet beneath the polished surfaces, accounts grew strained, expenses pressed upon her, and debts crept quietly into her life. Exile, however gilded, was costly, and without the endless wealth of a throne behind her, Soraya discovered the fragility of sustaining appearances in a world that demanded much. Her jewels, once gifts from the Shah, once emblems of their love and her queenship, became the first to leave her hands. Tiaras, necklaces, rings, each was taken from its velvet case, examined by discreet appraisers, and passed to auction houses where strangers bid upon them. To others, they were treasures, glittering fragments of royalty, objects of desire. To Soraya, they were pieces of her own story, heavy not with gold or diamonds, but with memory. Each jewel sold was not simply value lost, but a moment of her life surrendered. The tiara worn at her wedding, the necklace clasped around her throat during ceremonies, the ring that once shone as the Shah's token of love. To let them go was to let go of fragments of herself, yet necessity demanded it, and she complied with quiet resignation. The auctions drew fascination. Newspapers reported upon them, describing the jewels of the lost empress, the treasures of the queen in exile. Buyers from across the world sought to own a piece of her legend, and though money flowed into her accounts, it did not restore what was lost. For wealth can be replaced, but memory cannot. And Soraya knew that what she sold was not mere adornment, but the tangible echoes of her past. Beyond jewels, other possessions too were parted with. Paintings, furnishings, objects of refinement that had traveled with her from palace to exile. Her apartments grew barer, their walls less adorned, their rooms less radiant. She kept what she could, holding on to certain relics that meant too much to sell. Photographs, letters, small mementos that carried private meaning. But the grander items slipped away, carried into the hands of collectors who cherished them for their rarity, not for the sorrow they embodied. The world, once so eager to place her upon magazine covers, now watched her decline with curiosity tinged by pity. Some described her as tragic, others as extravagant, still others as careless with her fortune. Few understood the deeper truth, that her decline was not merely financial, but existential. For every object sold was a fragment of her identity, a piece of the empress she had once been, stripped away by necessity, leaving her more exposed, more vulnerable, more solitary. Legal struggles, too, marked these years. Disputes over inheritance, over estates, over property, drew her into courtrooms, places she loathed, places where dignity was replaced by paperwork and her name became line item and argument. She endured these with the same composure that had carried her through exile, but each dispute left her weary, drained, more aware than ever that even her remnants were fragile. To be reduced from empress to litigant, from queen to claimant, must have pierced her deeply, though she seldom revealed the wound. And yet, through all of this, she preserved her poise. She never begged, never displayed desperation, never allowed the world to see her broken. Even when her means dwindled, she walked with elegance, dressed with care, carried herself with the dignity of one who knew that grace cannot be sold. Friends remarked upon her serenity, her refusal to complain, her insistence on refinement, even in decline. If she suffered, she did so privately, her sorrow revealed only in the silences of her empty rooms. But what is dignity when loneliness presses heavily? What is refinement when possessions slip away? For Soraya, perhaps the answer lay not in what she owned, but in what she preserved within. She had lost her crown, her throne, her jewels, her wealth, but she had not lost the essence of herself, the quiet grace, the luminous presence, the sorrow that made her unforgettable. These remained even as her surroundings grew sparse. And yet, the decline was undeniable. By the late years of her life, she lived not in grandeur but in modest apartments, sustained by what remained of her fortune, by what little the sales had preserved. She was no longer the dazzling figure of magazines, no longer the luminous empress of photographs. She had become, instead, a woman of shadows, a figure remembered by some, forgotten by many, carrying the remnants of her life with quiet endurance. The echo of the gavel falling upon wood still seemed to linger, carrying with it the memory of jewels passed into strangers' hands. From that sound we move now into the quieter, darker corridors of her final years, when even the glitter of possessions no longer remained to distract her from the deep solitude that surrounded her. Soraya, once radiant amid palaces, once luminous in exile's salons, now lived increasingly in shadows, her world narrowed to the walls of modest apartments, her companions reduced to memories, letters, and the silence of her own thoughts. Illness returned to her often, not sudden but persistent, like a tide that rose and ebbed, yet never truly receded. Her body, fragile since youth, weakened further with age, its ailments leaving her weary, her movements slower, her strength diminished. Physicians came and went, offering remedies, prescribing rest, but none could lift the weight of decline. Pain crept into her bones, fatigue settled upon her, and the once radiant queen now found even the simplest tasks requiring effort. She bore it with the same dignity she had carried through every trial of her life, never complaining openly, never yielding to self-pity. Yet in private, she must have felt the sorrow of seeing her body betray her, of knowing that beauty and grace could not shield her from mortality. Her solitude deepened with each year. Friends who had once accompanied her in exile grew fewer. Some passed away, others drifted into their own lives, leaving Soraya increasingly alone. The salons of Paris no longer glittered with her presence as they once had. The photographers who had once chased her steps now seldom appeared. The world, always restless, had moved on to other faces, other stories, other tragedies. She remained admired by some, remembered by others, but she was no longer central to the public gaze. She became instead a figure of legend, spoken of with nostalgia, remembered in sighs, occasionally mentioned in newspapers when another of her jewels came to auction. Letters became her true companions. She wrote often, though many of her letters were never sent. Sheets of fine paper lay folded upon her desk, her handwriting elegant and precise, her words filled with reflections, with memories, with confessions too private to share. Some letters were addressed to family, others to friends, some to no one at all, as though she wrote simply to release the weight upon her heart. Perhaps she wrote to the Shah still, long after his death, words meant for the man she had loved most deeply, words he would never read. Perhaps she wrote to herself, to the girl she had once been, to the queen she had once become, to the exile she had always remained. These letters, unsent, were like conversations with ghosts, dialogues with memory, whispers into the silence. The walls of her apartments grew heavy with this silence. By day, the light of Paris or Rome spilled through her windows, illuminating rooms adorned with the remnants of her past. By night, lamps glowed softly, casting her shadow upon walls that seemed to lean inward, enclosing her more tightly. She arranged her rooms with care, placing flowers in vases, laying books neatly upon tables, preserving always the sense of dignity. Yet even the beauty she created around herself could not erase the solitude that pressed in from every side. To live without family of her own, without children, without a home to anchor her, was to live adrift, a life carried only by memory. She reflected often upon her past, upon the great arc of her life from Isfahan to Berlin, from Tehran to Paris. She thought of her childhood, of her marriage, of her exile, of her attempts at reinvention, of her romances, of her sorrows. She remembered the Shah most of all, the love they had shared, the parting that had defined her destiny. Did she ever wonder if she might meet him again in some other realm, beyond the veil of life? Did she hope for reunion, or did she resign herself to the truth that love once lost remains only in memory? Such questions must have haunted her in the long nights, when only the ticking of clocks kept her company. The world, meanwhile, seemed to forget. New generations grew, new leaders rose, new tragedies unfolded, and Soraya's name became less known, her face less recognized. Yet those who did remember spoke of her with tenderness, recalling her beauty, her sorrow, her dignity. She was no longer a presence in the present, but a memory, a story passed down, a legend of love undone by fate. She herself seemed to recede into this legend, living less as a participant in life than as a shadow of her own story. And yet, even as she faded, she endured. She did not collapse, did not surrender to despair, did not abandon dignity. She remained graceful, remained poised, remained luminous in her own quiet way. She lived not for spectacle, but for the small rituals that gave meaning to her days, the arrangement of flowers, the writing of letters, the sipping of tea in porcelain cups, the listening to records that carried her back to the gardens of her youth. These small acts sustained her, keeping her tethered to life even as the world drifted away. The unfinished letter lay upon her desk, the ink dried into silence, and from that stillness we step into the last chapter of Soraya's earthly life. It was the year 2001, and Paris, ever restless with its lights and voices, carried on unaware that within a quiet apartment one of its most enigmatic residents had slipped away. Soraya Esfandiari Bakhtiari, once the Empress of Iran, once the radiant face of love and sorrow, was found lifeless in her bed, alone as she had lived so much of her later years. Her passing was as quiet as her solitude, as though she had simply drifted from sleep into eternity, leaving behind her silence, her unsent letters, and the faint fragrance of memory. When news of her death reached the world, it spread swiftly, carried by newspapers, whispered in conversations, announced in broadcasts. "The Shah's lost empress is gone," they said. Headlines recalled her beauty, her tragedy, her role as the queen who had failed to bear an heir. Obituaries spoke of her as a figure of romance undone by fate, a woman who had once dazzled the world but who had died in obscurity. For a brief moment her name shone once more across the world, her face printed upon pages, her story retold. But as quickly as it rose, the attention faded again, and the silence that had accompanied her life returned to envelop her death. In her apartment, the few possessions she had left bore witness to her story. Photographs framed upon tables, some of her as a young bride, others of her family, still others of the Shah whose memory never left her. Books lined her shelves, many well-worn, their margins marked by her hand. Letters, some sent, some unsent, filled drawers carrying her voice across decades of exile. A few jewels remained, though most had long been sold, and even these seemed more like relics than adornments, fragments of a world no longer hers. Her rooms were modest, far from the splendor of palaces, but arranged with care, each object placed with dignity, each space touched with refinement. Her body was laid to rest in Munich beside her parents, far from the land of her birth, far from the palaces of Tehran, far from the man she had once loved most deeply. There was no grand funeral, no procession of nations, no throngs of mourners filling the streets. Instead, there was simplicity, quiet, the presence of family, of a few who still cherished her memory. She was buried not as empress, but as woman, not as queen, but as Soraya, the daughter of Khalil and Eva, the sister of Bijan, the soul who had walked a path of beauty and sorrow. Yet even in death, her story could not be separated from legend, for the world remembered her not only as herself, but as symbol. To some, she was the tragic beauty, the fairy tale princess undone by fate. To others, she was the queen of hearts, the Shah's only true love. To others still, she was the emblem of wasted grandeur, of exile, of sorrow. She herself had been more than all these, but memory simplifies, and so she remained frozen in history's gaze as the lost empress, her essence distilled into a single image of beauty touched by tragedy. How must it feel, one wonders, to live and die as legend, to be remembered more for what was lost than for what was lived? Soraya's story is both luminous and sorrowful, both admired and mourned. She carried within her dignity, grace, and a sorrow that deepened into poetry. She endured exile without bitterness, bore loss without spectacle, faced death without fear. Her life was not triumphant, but it was profound, marked not by victories but by endurance. Perhaps in her final moments she found peace. Perhaps the silence that had so long accompanied her became at last a comfort, a soft passage from solitude into rest. Perhaps she closed her eyes and saw once more the gardens of Isfahan, the fountains of Sadabad, the face of the Shah in his youth, the laughter of children she had longed for but never heard. Perhaps, in that final breath, she was no longer alone, but surrounded by the echoes of all she had loved and lost. The silence of her room after her passing lingers, heavy yet fragile, as though the air itself still holds the trace of her presence. From that stillness we turn now to the final chapter, not of her life, which ended in solitude, but of her legacy, which remains suspended between memory and forgetting. For Soraya's story did not vanish with her last breath. It continues, retold in whispers, in books, in the sighs of those who remember her beauty, in the melancholy of those who recall her fate. And yet, like all legacies, it is uncertain, shaped as much by myth as by truth, as much by what is imagined as by what is known. She is remembered foremost as the Shah's lost empress, the woman he loved but could not keep. In this image, her life becomes a romance undone by destiny, a fairy tale that dissolved into tragedy. To many, she embodies the sorrow of love defeated not by betrayal or cruelty, but by necessity, by the inexorable demands of dynasty. Hers is a story that stirs tenderness in the heart, for it reveals the fragility of even the greatest love when weighed against the scales of empire. She is remembered as the one who left Tehran in silence, the queen whose tears were hidden behind dark glasses, the figure who carried her sorrow into exile with dignity. But is that all she was? Was she only the symbol of loss, the tragic heroine whose worth is measured by absence? Or was she something more, an individual whose inner life remains hidden from the world's gaze, whose thoughts and dreams were known only to herself? History often reduces lives to symbols, and Soraya's life has been distilled into beauty and sorrow. Yet beneath those surfaces lay complexity, the quiet strength of endurance, the dignity of bearing sorrow without spectacle, the longing for belonging that shaped every choice she made. For some, she is remembered as a symbol of wasted grandeur. They see in her story the tragedy of a life that might have been great, but was instead diminished. A life that drifted into obscurity, a life where beauty became both gift and burden. They recall her attempts at cinema, her romances in exile, her decline into financial struggles, and they sigh that such a woman should end her days alone. To them, her story is cautionary, a reminder that even the brightest stars can fade, that even queens can die in solitude. For others, she is remembered as an enduring figure of grace. They admire her dignity, her refusal to surrender to bitterness, her ability to carry herself with poise even as life stripped away her crown, her jewels, her companions. They see in her not failure but endurance, not waste but resilience, not tragedy but a kind of quiet triumph over sorrow. For though she lost much, she never lost herself. She remained Soraya, luminous even in exile, radiant even in decline, remembered not for scandal or cruelty, but for her grace under suffering. And yet questions remain, lingering like shadows at dusk. Was she truly happy in any season of her life? Did she ever find peace in her exile? Or was she always haunted by the garden gates of Tehran closing behind her? Did she regret her choices, or did she accept them as the unfolding of destiny? Was she a victim of fate, or a participant in her own undoing? History does not answer, for her silence was profound, her voice seldom revealed, her letters often left unsent. She remains, even in memory, a figure of ambiguity, a woman glimpsed through veils, her truth never fully known. Perhaps this is why she lingers so strongly in imagination, for in her unresolvedness people see their own longings, their own sorrows, their own questions. She is at once empress and exile, beloved and abandoned, radiant and sorrowful, remembered and forgotten. She is a mirror in which others see their own fragility, their own dreams undone by time. In this way, her legacy transcends her life, becoming less about Iran, less about monarchy, and more about the universal truths of love and loss, of beauty and sorrow, of memory and forgetting. The poets of Persia often wrote that beauty and sorrow are inseparable, that roses bloom only beside thorns, that love is always shadowed by loss. Soraya's life seems to embody this truth. She bloomed radiantly, admired across the world, yet her beauty was entwined with sorrow, her love undone by destiny, her crown lost to necessity. And yet, like the rose, she remained fragrant even in her decline, remembered even when withered, cherished even when absent. Her legacy is not of power, nor of achievement, but of presence. The quiet, haunting presence of a woman who lived between light and shadow,